The clock on the console read 03:47. Below the frozen plains of Montana, 60 feet of reinforced concrete and steel separated Captain John Keller from the world. Down here, in the sterile, climate-controlled tomb of the Echo flight launch control capsule, the world was an abstraction, a series of data points and status lights on a dull green panel. His world was this cramped space, shared with his deputy commander, Lieutenant Mark Davies, and the 10 angels of death they babysat. 10 Minuteman I intercontinental ballistic missiles, each tipped with a warhead capable of turning a distant, unknown city into a column of radioactive fire. The air, thick with the hum of electronics and the recycled breath of 2 men, tasted of copper and quiet dread. This was the frontier of the Cold War, a silent subterranean vigil against Armageddon. For months, this vigil had been an exercise in profound monotony. Drills, system checks, coded authentications, and the endless, waiting silence. But on this frigid March night in 1967, the silence was about to be broken. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper of electronic wrongness. A single light on the missile status board flickered. It was the indicator for Launch Facility E4. For a fraction of a second, it wavered between green, the color of readiness, the color of strategic alert, and an ambiguous amber. Keller's heart, a steady, disciplined metronome, skipped a beat. He and Davies exchanged a look, a silent conversation honed over hundreds of hours spent in this steel coffin. An anomaly, a glitch, nothing more. But then, the light for E4 snapped from green to a solid, glaring red. The corresponding panel lit up with a single damning phrase, "No go." The missile was offline. Before Keller could even process the implication, another light, E7, followed suit. Then E2. Within the span of 10 seconds, a cascade of failures rippled across the board. Green lights blinked out, replaced by the angry crimson of malfunction. One by one, their 10 charges, the most reliable and fearsome weapons ever devised by humankind, were being neutered. An alarm, a shrill, piercing tone designed to cut through the fog of sleep and complacency, shrieked to life. The capsule, once a sanctuary of control, became a cacophony of failure. Keller's hands flew across his console, his fingers dancing a practiced ballet of diagnostic procedures. This was impossible. The Minuteman system was designed with redundant, triply redundant safeguards. It was hardened against the electromagnetic pulse of a nearby nuclear detonation. It was a closed loop, a self-contained network designed to be impenetrable. No single failure point, no conceivable glitch could account for a simultaneous sequential shutdown of the entire flight. His training screamed at him, Soviet sabotage, a decapitation strike. But the other warning systems, the ones that would signal an incoming attack, remained dark and silent. There were no klaxons. For incoming warheads, no authentication codes from Strategic Air Command demanding a launch. There was only this, a creeping, inexplicable paralysis of their arsenal. Davies was on the phone, his voice tight with a tension that bordered on panic, shouting at the flight security controller topside. The line crackled with static. Keller could only make out fragments. "What do you see? Say again? Describe it." Then Davies slammed the receiver down, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with training manuals or Soviet missile doctrine. He looked at Keller, his professional composure shattered. "They're seeing something up there," he stammered. "A light, a big, silent red light. It's right over the launch facility." Keller stared at the console, a sea of red lights that reflected in his wide eyes. 10 nuclear missiles, inert, an unidentified object hovering over their silos. The alarm continued its relentless scream. Down in the earth, the guardians of the apocalypse had lost control. The weapons were offline, the rules no longer applied, and a chilling question began to form in the deepest recesses of his mind, a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If this wasn't a malfunction, and it wasn't the Soviets, then who or what had just disarmed them? The world outside the capsule was no longer an abstraction. It had come knocking, and 60 feet of concrete and steel suddenly felt very, very thin. The incident at Echo Flight did not happen in a vacuum. It was a single dramatic crescendo in a symphony of the strange that had played out for years across the vast empty stage of central Montana. This is Big Sky Country, a land of stark elemental beauty, where the curvature of the earth is a visible reality and the sky is a dominating, overwhelming presence. It is a landscape that dwarfs human endeavor, a place where horizons stretch into infinity and the silence is so profound it feels like a physical weight. In the 1960s, this ancient windswept land of ranchers and reservations became the chessboard for the Cold War's deadliest game. Beneath the fields of wheat and the grazing pastures, the United States Air Force planted a garden of atomic death. Malmstrom Air Force Base near Great Falls became the nerve center for one of the largest ICBM complexes in the world. 200 Minuteman missiles were sunk into reinforced concrete silos scattered across thousands of square miles of prairie, forming a defensive ring around the heartland of America. Each missile was a silent sentinel waiting for a command that everyone prayed would never come. They were the ultimate deterrent, the guarantors of a terrifying doctrine known as mutually assured destruction. Their very existence was meant to keep the peace by promising unimaginable violence. To operate this sprawling network of subterranean weapons, the Air Force needed a special breed of soldier, the missileers. Young officers, many of them fresh out of college, were subjected to a grueling battery of psychological and technical training. They were chosen for their stability, their discipline, and their ability to function under unimaginable pressure. They were taught to live with a paradox, to be prepared at a moment's notice to execute an order that would end civilization as they knew it, while simultaneously hoping that moment would never arrive. Captain John Keller was the archetype of this new warrior class, disciplined, analytical, and utterly committed to the mission. He understood the gravity of his post, the weight of the keys that hung around his neck. He and his partner, like all missileers, worked in 24-hour shifts in the launch control capsules, the underground bunkers known affectionately as the Hole. These capsules were marvels of engineering, designed to survive anything short of a direct nuclear hit. 2 officers, always 2, locked inside a space no bigger than a small recreational vehicle, surrounded by the humming machinery that connected them to their 10 warheads. But the technological isolation was compounded by a profound geographical and psychological solitude. The launch facilities were remote, often miles from the nearest paved road. Topside, the only signs of the immense power buried below were a chain-link fence, an array of antennas, and a massive concrete blast door. Security was provided by small teams of air policemen, young enlisted men who patrolled the frozen, windswept perimeters, guarding against a terrestrial threat that seemed abstract and unlikely in this empty quarter of the world. It was this very emptiness, this vast and silent landscape, that seemed to attract the unexplained. Long before the missile silos were dug, local lore was filled with tales of strange lights in the sky. Ranchers spoke of silent, hovering glows that spooked their cattle. Native American traditions from the Blackfeet and Crow tribes contained stories of star people and visitors from the sky. With the arrival of the Cold War infrastructure, these folkloric tales took on a modern technological edge. Pilots from Malmstrom reported anomalous radar contacts. Maintenance crews working on remote silos at night would see lights that moved in ways no known aircraft could. These reports were filed, classified, and forgotten. They were dismissed as misidentified stars, weather phenomena, or the predictable side effects of stress and isolation on young men tasked with an awesome responsibility. The official culture of the Strategic Air Command, under the iron fist of General Curtis LeMay, had no room for ambiguity or fantasy. You followed the book, you trusted your instruments, you did not report flying saucers. And so, a quiet conspiracy of silence took hold. The strange events were relegated to hushed conversations in the barracks, late-night confessions over a beer, stories told and then quickly disavowed. But the pattern was there, a faint signal in the noise, for anyone willing to look. There was a persistent, unnerving interest being shown in America's nuclear arsenal by something unknown. The sky over Montana, it seemed, was watching. And in the weeks leading up to the March 1967 incident at Echo Flight, the watching intensified. It was as if a silent, methodical reconnaissance was underway. The prelude to the main event was about to begin. The sentinels in their concrete tombs had no idea they were the ones being observed, their doomsday weapons the subject of an intense and utterly alien curiosity. The stage was set, not for a war between superpowers, but for an encounter that would shatter the very foundations of their carefully constructed reality. The calm before the storm was drawing to a close. The first thread in the tapestry of that impossible night was pulled not in the subterranean command post, but on the windswept surface above it. The duty of guarding the Echo Flight Launch Control Facility fell to a small security alert team led by Sergeant Frank Miller. Miller was a career Air Force NCO, a man who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of his job: keep unauthorized personnel away from the gate. His domain was a flat, featureless patch of Montana prairie, distinguished only by the razor wire fence and the squat concrete entrance building that led down to the LCC. His nights were long, cold, and achingly monotonous, a cycle of perimeter checks and coffee-fueled vigilance against threats that felt more theoretical than real. The enemy was in Moscow, not hiding in the coulees and ravines of Judith Basin County. On this particular night, the wind was a living thing, a relentless, keening force that scoured the landscape and drove the temperature into the single digits. The sky was a black, starless void, the usual canopy of celestial diamonds smothered by a low, thick cloud ceiling. Around 01:30, Miller and his airmen were conducting a routine check of the perimeter fence when the first anomaly appeared. It was not a thunderous arrival. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible tear in the fabric of the night, a single point of light high in the southern sky. At first, Miller dismissed it: a high-altitude jet, a satellite catching a stray reflection of a distant sun. But it didn't behave like a plane or a satellite. It hung motionless for a moment, impossibly still against the wind that buffeted the men on the ground. Then, it began to move. Its motion was fluid, silent, and utterly unnatural. It executed a series of maneuvers that defied the known laws of physics and aerodynamics. It would accelerate from a dead stop to a blistering speed in an instant, leaving no trail, creating no sonic boom. It made sharp, instantaneous right-angle turns, a feat that would have subjected any human pilot to crushing, fatal G-forces. It pulsed with a soft internal luminescence, shifting in color from a brilliant white to a soft orange. Miller and his men were trained observers. They knew the silhouettes of every friendly and enemy aircraft. They knew the patterns of satellites, the look of weather balloons, the telltale strobe of a commercial airliner. This was none of those things. This was something else. A knot of professional curiosity mixed with primal fear tightened in Miller's stomach. He grabbed the handset of his radio and called the LCC, reporting the sighting to the missile crew below. The response from underground was skeptical but professional. They noted his report in the log and told him to keep them advised. For the next hour, the object, or perhaps several objects, played a bizarre cat-and-mouse game in the sky above the missile field. They would appear, perform their impossible acrobatics, and then vanish, only to reappear moments later in a different sector of the sky. The security teams at the other 9 missile silos that comprised Echo Flight began calling in. They were seeing it too. A strange ballet of silent lights was being performed directly over one of the most sensitive and powerful weapon systems on the planet. The initial confusion on the ground was hardening into a palpable sense of dread. These were not random lights. Their movements seemed intelligent, purposeful, and their focus seemed to be the missile silos themselves. Around 03:30, the situation escalated dramatically. One of the lights, a larger, more distinct object that glowed with a menacing reddish-orange hue, detached itself from the aerial display. It descended rapidly, purposefully, directly toward the Echo Flight LCF. The men on the ground could only watch, their rifles feeling like useless toys, their bodies frozen in a state of terrified awe. It was not a plane. It had no wings, no tail, no visible means of propulsion. It was a pure geometric shape, a flattened disk or sphere of solid light that seemed to warp the very air around it. The most unnerving characteristic was its silence. An object of its apparent size moving through the atmosphere at that speed should have produced a deafening roar. But there was nothing, not a whisper. The only sound was the howling of the Montana wind, a sound that seemed to be swallowed by the object's oppressive presence. It came to a dead stop, hovering perhaps 200 feet above the front gate of the launch facility. It bathed the entire compound in an eerie, pulsating crimson light. The shadows of the fences and antennas danced in a grotesque pantomime. The air crackled with a strange energy, like the moments before a lightning strike. The men felt the hair on their arms and the back of their necks stand on end. Sergeant Miller, his voice trembling but his training taking over, grabbed his radio again. This was no longer just a UFO sighting. This was a direct incursion. An unknown craft of unknown origin was violating the airspace of a top-secret nuclear installation. He fumbled with the handset, his fingers numb from the cold and the fear, and screamed into it, trying to describe the unbelievable scene unfolding before his eyes. It was his panicked, static-laced call that reached Captain Keller and Lieutenant Davies 60 feet below, at the precise moment their world of green lights was collapsing into a sea of red. The chaos topside was now directly linked to the chaos below. The silent visitor wasn't just observing, it was acting. The connection was undeniable, terrifying, and utterly beyond their comprehension. Down in the capsule, the world had shrunk to the size of the glowing red console. Captain Keller and Lieutenant Davies moved with the frenetic precision of men trained for the unthinkable. Their minds, however, were struggling to catch up with the reality of their instruments. The diagnostic checklists, the emergency protocols, the entire library of procedures they had memorized were proving useless. The failures they were witnessing were not in the book. The missile systems weren't just malfunctioning. They were being systematically and surgically dismantled by an unseen hand. Each of the 10 Minuteman missiles was a complex, self-contained ecosystem of electronics. They had their own internal power sources, their own guidance and control packages. For all 10 to fail simultaneously, it would require 10 separate, catastrophic, and identical malfunctions. The statistical probability was not just low, it was functionally zero. Yet, the board in front of them was a testament to the impossible. The no-go lights were absolute. They indicated a fault within the missile's guidance and control system, a fatal error that made a launch impossible. A missile in no-go state was, for all intents and purposes, just 100 tons of inert metal and fuel sitting in a hole. Their flight of 10 nuclear-tipped ICBMs had been turned into a flight of 10 very expensive paperweights. Keller's mind raced through the possibilities. An enemy-induced electromagnetic pulse? No, the systems were hardened for that, and it would have likely affected the entire squadron, not just their flight. A coordinated act of sabotage by ground teams? Inconceivable. It would require 10 separate teams to infiltrate 10 separate high-security silos at the exact same moment. It was a logistical nightmare that bordered on science fiction. He kept coming back to the call from Sergeant Miller, to the fragmented, terrified description of the red light hovering over the facility. A part of his rational, analytical brain, the part that had been forged at the Air Force Academy, fought against the conclusion that was forming. Coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. A massive, inexplicable power surge or system glitch that just happened to occur at the same time a security guard got spooked by a helicopter or an atmospheric anomaly. But the other part of his brain, the primal, intuitive part, knew better. The timing was too perfect. The event too specific. The call from the surface had been the overture. The failure cascade on his console was the main performance. Davies was on the phone again, this time to the squadron command post, his voice a strained monotone as he reported the status of each missile. Echo 1, no go. Echo 2, no go. Echo 3, no go. He sounded like a physician reading a list of casualties. With each report, the reality of their situation became more concrete, more terrifying. They were defenseless. The primary mission of the Strategic Air Command, to provide a constant, credible nuclear deterrent, had been compromised. and nobody knew why. The static-ridden voice of Sergeant Miller crackled back over the speaker in the capsule. He was shouting now, his words tumbling over each other in a torrent of fear and disbelief. "It's still here. It's just sitting here. There's no sound. God, there's no sound." Keller could feel the panic from the surface seeping through the concrete, a palpable wave of terror that transcended the physical distance. The men up there were armed with M16s, trained to repel a Soviet Spetsnaz attack. What were they supposed to do against a silent, hovering light that could shut down nuclear missiles at will? The feeling of helplessness in the capsule was absolute. They were pilots with no plane, watchmen with no weapons. They were trapped in a steel box, blind and powerless, while an unknown entity toyed with the most dangerous technology on Earth. The shrill alarm continued to blare, a soundtrack to their descent into chaos. The red lights on the console didn't flicker or change. They glowed with a steady, damning intensity. The message was clear. Whatever was happening, it was not a glitch. It was a deliberate, controlled, and devastatingly effective action. The unseen visitor was not just observing, it was demonstrating. It was making a statement. And as Keller stared at the board, the full chilling weight of that statement settled upon him. The message was simple. Your most powerful weapons are meaningless. Your control is an illusion. You are not in charge. The climax of the encounter was not a battle of weapons, but a confrontation of realities. For the men on the surface, it was a primal sensory overload. The object that hung in the air above Echo Flight was a violation of every known principle of their world. It was a silent wound in the night sky, a pulsating orb of crimson light that seemed to drink the darkness around it. Sergeant Miller and his team, crouched behind their security vehicle, felt a profound and unnerving sense of being scrutinized. The light was not just a light, it felt like an eye. An unblinking, intelligent, and utterly alien gaze that stripped them of their agency, reducing them from armed guards to helpless specimens under a microscope. The object was perhaps 100 feet in diameter, a classic disc shape, though its edges were indistinct, blurring into the night as if the air itself were shimmering with heat. It emitted no sound, no vibration, no exhaust. Its presence was defined by an overwhelming absence of the expected. The pulsating red glow it cast was not like the light from a fire or a flare. It was a cold light, a sterile light that did not seem to reflect off surfaces so much as it seemed to soak into them, painting the snow-dusted ground, the concrete facility, and the terrified faces of the men in a monochromatic, hellish hue. The psychological impact was devastating. The human mind struggles to process phenomena that fall so far outside its frame of reference. The men experienced a cognitive dissonance so extreme it bordered on a waking nightmare. Their training had prepared them for firefights, for bomb threats, for human adversaries. It had not prepared them for a silent, hovering God machine that could disable nuclear missiles. Fear was the dominant emotion, but it was a complex, layered fear. There was the immediate animal fear of a potential threat, but beneath it was a deeper, more existential dread. The object's silent, effortless superiority was a terrifying declaration of their own technological and perhaps even biological insignificance. It was the fear of the anthill in the path of the bulldozer. Mixed with this fear was an undeniable, almost sacrilegious sense of awe. They were witnessing something transcendent, something that shattered the mundane boundaries of human experience. It was terrible, but it was also magnificent. A silent, red apocalypse hanging in the Montana sky. The object remained motionless over the facility for what felt like an eternity, but was likely no more than 4 or 5 minutes. It was a period of suspended time where the normal laws of the universe seemed to have been temporarily repealed. Then, as abruptly and inexplicably as it had arrived, its demonstration concluded. The object began to ascend. It did not climb like a helicopter or a jet. It simply moved upward, accelerating at a rate that seemed to defy inertia. The pulsating red light intensified for a brief moment into a brilliant, blinding point, and then it was gone. It didn't fly away over the horizon. It shot straight up, a vertical streak of light that vanished into the overcast sky in less than a second. One moment it was there, a dominant, terrifying presence. The next, there was only the black sky, The howling wind and the lingering ghostly afterimage burned into the retinas of the witnesses. The sudden return to normalcy was almost as jarring as the appearance of the object itself. The unnatural red glow was gone, replaced by the harsh, familiar white of the facility's security lights. The oppressive silence was lifted, and the mundane sounds of the prairie night rushed back in. All that remained was the evidence. On the surface, the evidence was the shared, indelible memory of the security personnel, a story so incredible they feared no one would ever believe them. And 60 feet below, the evidence was undeniable, glowing on the console in front of Captain Keller and Lieutenant Davies. A solid bank of 10 red lights, 10 disabled nuclear missiles. The visitor was gone, but its calling card remained. The immediate aftermath was a blur of frantic, by-the-book procedure colliding with unprecedented reality. Strike teams were scrambled from Malmstrom. Within the hour, the remote facility was swarming with Air Force personnel. Engineers from Boeing, the missile's manufacturer, were flown in, and most ominously, agents from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the AFOC, descended upon Echo Flight. Their job was not to fix the missiles, but to control the story. The official investigation began before the sun had even risen, and from its very inception, it had 2 parallel goals: to understand the technical cause of the shutdown and to ensure that the testimony of the witnesses never saw the light of day. This is where the investigator, Daniel Cross, enters the narrative, not in 1967, but decades later. Cross was a former Air Force intelligence analyst, a man who had spent his career inside the machinery of national security. After leaving the service, he dedicated his life to a singular, obsessive quest to peel back the layers of secrecy surrounding the UFO phenomenon, specifically its apparent fascination with nuclear weapons facilities. He operated in the shadowy world of declassified documents, Freedom of Information Act requests, and hushed anonymous interviews with retired military personnel. For Cross, the Malmstrom incident was the Rosetta Stone, the single best documented case of a direct hostile interaction between an unidentified intelligence and the U.S. nuclear arsenal. His investigation, pieced together from fragmented reports and the reluctant testimony of men who had been sworn to silence, painted a stark picture of an official cover-up. The witnesses, Keller, Davies, Miller, and the other security guards, were immediately separated and subjected to intense interrogations. They were not treated as observers of a historic event, but as suspects. The AFOC agents were hostile, accusatory. Were they on drugs? Had they been drinking? Were they hallucinating? The questions were designed to intimidate, to undermine their confidence in what they had seen. Each man wrote a detailed report. Each man's story was identical. A silent, red, disc-shaped object hovered over the facility at the exact time the missiles went down. And each man was then forced to sign a national security non-disclosure agreement, a legally binding document that forbade them from ever speaking about the incident to anyone, under penalty of imprisonment. They were told, in no uncertain terms, that what they saw did not happen. The official narrative was being forged in real time. The explanation, the one that would be entered into the logs and fed up the chain of command, was that Echo Flight had experienced a one-of-a-kind computer glitch or a power surge of unknown origin. The UFO sighting was to be officially classified as a coincidence. The men were ordered to forget it, but Cross, in his meticulous research, found the cracks in that official story. He discovered that the maintenance logs and the reports from the Boeing engineers could not identify any single cause for the failure. The teams that were sent into the silos to bring the missiles back online were baffled. There was no physical damage, no fried circuits, no evidence of a power surge. The guidance and control systems had simply stopped. They had to be reset manually, one by one. It was as if a switch had been thrown by an invisible force, and then, after the visitor departed, the switch was left in the off position. The investigators' work revealed the inherent contradiction at the heart of the Air Force's response. If it were merely a technical glitch, a freak accident, why the intense secrecy? Why the threats? Why the systematic intimidation of multiple credible military witnesses? The answer, Cross concluded, was simple and terrifying. The Air Force knew it wasn't a glitch. They knew they had lost control of 10 nuclear missiles to an unknown, technologically superior power. And that was a truth so profound, so destabilizing to the global balance of power and to the public's sense of security, that it could not be allowed to exist. The story had to be buried, and buried deep. The men of Echo Flight became the first casualties of that cover-up, their extraordinary experience erased from the official record, their truth sacrificed at the altar of national security. The machinery of denial, once set in motion, is a powerful and relentless force. For the authority, in this case the United States Air Force and the broader national security apparatus, an event like the Echo Flight shutdown presents an existential crisis. It is a problem not of technology, but of narrative. The story of a UFO disabling nuclear missiles is not a story that can be told. It undermines the very foundation of their power, which is built on an image of absolute control and technological supremacy. Therefore, the first and most critical task is to create a new story, a plausible, prosaic explanation that can be substituted for the unbelievable truth. The primary tool for this narrative management in the 1960s was Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official public-facing study of the UFO phenomenon. Blue Book had a dual and often contradictory mandate: to investigate UFO reports and to debunk them. Its unwritten primary mission was public relations, to reassure the American people that strange lights in the sky were nothing to worry about. The Malmstrom case, with its high-level military witnesses and direct impact on national security, was far too sensitive for the low-level investigators at Blue Book. It was handled internally, at the highest levels of the Strategic Air Command. But the Blue Book methodology, the playbook for explaining away the unexplained, was followed to the letter. First, isolate the data points, the visual. Sighting by the security guards was treated as a separate, unrelated event from the missile shutdown. By decoupling the two, the staggering coincidence could be framed as just that, a coincidence. The shutdown became a purely technical problem for the engineers to solve. The sighting became a minor, anecdotal report from excitable guards on a dark night. Second, generate an expert-sanctioned alternative theory. The Boeing engineers, under immense pressure to find a rational explanation, eventually hypothesized that a unique electrical phenomenon known as a standing wave might have been generated by the specific layout of the power cables and equipment at Echo Flight. This standing wave, a theoretical and never replicated anomaly, could have created an electromagnetic field powerful enough to interfere with the missile guidance systems. It was a perfect explanation from the authorities' point of view. It was highly technical, impossible for a layman to disprove, and it placed the blame on a freak conjunction of their own technology, not on an outside force. It was an elegant, self-contained fiction. The standing wave theory became the official classified explanation for the Echo Flight incident. It explained the missile failures without ever having to acknowledge the presence of the UFO. The testimony of Sergeant Miller and his men was conveniently ignored, dismissed as irrelevant to the technical solution. Years later, the Condon Committee, a university-led study funded by the Air Force and designed to be the final word on UFOs, would briefly review the Malmstrom case. Dr. Robert Lowe, the project coordinator, in a now infamous internal memo, revealed the committee's true purpose, stating that the study would be conducted almost exclusively by non-believers who, although they couldn't possibly prove a negative result, could and probably would add an impressive body of evidence that there is no reality to the observations. Unsurprisingly, the Condon report concluded that UFOs presented no threat to national security and were not worthy of further scientific study. It selectively presented evidence that supported its foregone conclusion, and in the case of Malmstrom, it accepted the Air Force's internal explanation of a systems malfunction, barely mentioning the eyewitness testimony from the launch officers and security personnel. The authority had successfully closed the loop. The official record from the initial AFOSI investigation to the final Condon report was now consistent. The Echo Flight incident was a technical glitch. The UFO was a mirage. The case was closed. But for the investigator, Daniel Cross, And for the men who were actually there, this official explanation was a greater fiction than any tale of little green men. It was a carefully constructed lie, a bureaucratic sleight of hand designed to mask a terrifying vulnerability. The standing wave theory couldn't explain why the same glitch had happened a week earlier. Another missile flight, Oscar flight. It couldn't explain why similar incidents would continue to be reported at other ICBM bases across the country, and most importantly, it couldn't explain the silent red object that hung in the sky, a silent witness to the lie itself. The authority had written its version of history. The truth, however, had a stubborn way of surviving in the margins, in the memories of the haunted and the research of the obsessed. A single data point, no matter how dramatic, can be dismissed as an anomaly. But when data points begin to form a line, a pattern emerges that is impossible to ignore. The work of an investigator like Daniel Cross is akin to celestial cartography, connecting scattered, dimly lit stars to reveal a hidden constellation. The Echo Flight incident of March 1967 was not an isolated event. It was the brightest star in a pattern of activity that stretched across the entire American nuclear landscape. By digging through archives and cultivating a network of retired military sources, Cross began to uncover the echoes of Echo Flight. He found that just 1 week prior, on March 16, 1967, a nearly identical event had occurred at another Malmstrom launch control facility, Oscar Flight. A UFO was sighted by a maintenance crew working on a silo. Shortly thereafter, the entire flight of 10 Minuteman missiles dropped into no-go status one by one. The incident was quickly classified, the maintenance crew debriefed and silenced. The official explanation was, once again, a system malfunction. But the pattern was undeniable. A UFO sighting, followed immediately by a catastrophic, sequential failure of multiple nuclear missiles. This was not a coincidence. This was a cause and an effect. The constellation grew brighter. Cross unearthed reports from F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming in 1965, where a UFO was tracked on radar descending over a launch facility, at which point the missile inside reportedly had its targeting data inexplicably wiped. He found accounts from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, where pilots were scrambled to intercept large, silent, hovering objects that would play cat and mouse with their fighter jets over the missile fields, easily outmaneuvering them before vanishing at impossible speeds. He collected testimony from radar operators at Malmstrom, who, on the very night of the Echo Flight incident, had tracked an object on their scopes that descended over the base, hovered, and then shot straight up off the screen in a single radar sweep. Their logs were confiscated, and they were ordered to never speak of it. Each story, taken alone, could be dismissed. A radar ghost, a misidentified aircraft, a faulty memory. But taken together, they formed a mosaic of irrefutable evidence. A highly advanced non-human intelligence was demonstrating a clear, persistent, and unsettling interest in humanity's most destructive weapons. It was systematically mapping, monitoring, and, when it chose, neutralizing the nuclear deterrent of a global superpower. The evidence was not merely anecdotal. It came from trained military observers, launch officers, security police, radar operators, maintenance technicians, and fighter pilots. These were not unreliable, hysterical civilians. They were the sober, disciplined men and women entrusted with the nation's defense. And their testimony, suppressed and compartmentalized by the authority, told a consistent and terrifying story. The implications of this pattern were staggering. What was the purpose of these incursions? Was it a benign act of observation, a kind of galactic anthropology? Or was it something more menacing? A strategic probing of defenses, a mapping of vulnerabilities, a quiet demonstration of technological dominance. The behavior was not overtly hostile, yet the act of disabling nuclear weapons was profoundly aggressive. It was a message delivered with surgical precision. Cross began to see the phenomenon not as a random collection of sightings, but as a covert, low-intensity conflict, a silent Cold War being waged in the skies above our most secret installations. The conflicting evidence created an unbridgeable chasm between the official narrative and the lived experience of the witnesses. The authority insisted it was a series of unrelated technical glitches. The evidence insisted it was a coordinated campaign by an unknown intelligence. For Daniel Cross, the conclusion was inescapable. The greatest secret of the Cold War was not the number of warheads in the American or Soviet arsenals. It was the fact that a third party, a player not accounted for in any war game or strategic doctrine, had a seat at the table, and it held a veto. This secret was so profound that it had to be protected at all costs, even if it meant denying the reality of hundreds of its own servicemen. The silence from the government was not a sign that nothing was happening. It was a sign that something so important was happening, it could never be admitted. The official story dies on paper, in reports and archives. The truth, however, lives on in the minds of those who were there. For the witnesses of Echo Flight, the incident was not a case file to be closed. It was a life-altering event, a psychic wound that never fully healed. They became keepers of a profound secret, a burden they were forced to carry in silence and isolation for decades. Captain John Keller, the young, by-the-book missileer, found his promising Air Force career quietly and inexplicably stalled. He was never overtly punished, but the promotions he deserved never materialized. He was shuffled off to less sensitive assignments, his proximity to the nuclear keys revoked. He understood the unspoken message. He was now a liability. He was the man who had seen too much. For years, he honored the non-disclosure agreement he had signed. He buried the memory, tried to convince himself that the official explanation was true. But the image of the eBay console full of red lights and the sound of Sergeant Miller's panicked voice were seared into his memory. The experience created a permanent fissure in his worldview. He had been a loyal soldier in a system he believed in, a system built on order, logic, and control. That night, he had come face to face with something that was beyond that system, something that operated on a level of reality his training had never prepared him for. The psychological toll was immense. To possess knowledge of such monumental importance and to be forced to deny its existence is a form of psychological torture. It creates a deep and abiding sense of alienation, not only from the institution you served, but from the rest of society, which remains blissfully unaware. Sergeant Frank Miller, the man who had stared directly into the crimson eye of the unknown, left the Air Force a few years after the incident. He returned to civilian life, but he was a changed man. The world no longer seemed as solid or as predictable as it once had. He was haunted by the silence of the object, by its effortless, arrogant display of power. How do you explain to your family and friends that you once stood guard while a UFO disarmed nuclear missiles? You don't. You keep the secret locked away, where it festers, breeding paranoia and a deep-seated distrust of authority. The witness archetype is a tragic one. They are ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary circumstance, and for their trouble, their credibility is attacked, their careers are ruined, and their sanity is questioned. They are the inconvenient variable in the neat equation of official denial. Their testimony is the ghost in the machine, the stubborn fact that refuses to align with the accepted narrative. The missile base itself, the physical location of the event, takes on a new character in the aftermath. The desolate patch of Montana prairie is no longer just a military installation. It is a place where the veil between worlds grew thin, a modern-day sacred site where a profound mystery was enacted. The silos, still active for many years after, held their Minuteman missiles, but they also held a secret. They became monuments to a moment when humanity's ultimate power was rendered impotent by a power infinitely greater. The investigator, Daniel Cross, in his interviews with these men late in their lives, found that their stories had not changed in over 30 years. The details were as crisp and clear as if they had happened yesterday. Their testimony was the bedrock of his investigation, the human truth that defied decades of official obfuscation. Their burden became his purpose. The aftermath of Echo Flight is not just about a cover-up, it is about the human cost of keeping secrets. It is the story of good men who were forced to deny their own senses, to betray their own experiences in service of a greater good they did not understand. And it raises a fundamental question. What is the nature of proof when the UET? Only evidence is the testimony of credible observers, testimony that the authority has already decided to reject. The answer, perhaps, is that some truths are not meant to be proven, only to be witnessed. And the burden of that witness is the price of admission to a larger and far stranger universe. The story of echo flight, when stripped down to its core components, presents us with a set of facts that are as undeniable as they are unbelievable. Multiple trained military observers in separate locations witnessed an unidentified aerial object. Simultaneously, 10 nuclear missiles under their command suffered a catastrophic and inexplicable systems failure. An official investigation was launched, which resulted in the witnesses being silenced and the event being attributed to a never-replicated technical malfunction. This is where the story ends for the authority. But for the rest of us, this is where the real questions begin. Why? Why would a technologically superior, non-human intelligence travel across unimaginable distances to play games with our nuclear weapons? The question opens a Pandora's box of possibilities, ranging from the benevolent to the terrifying. One school of thought, favored by some researchers, posits that these incursions are a form of galactic quarantine. The message being sent is a warning. Humanity, having unlocked the power of the atom, had become a potential threat, not just to itself, but to its cosmic neighbors. The ability to travel between the stars may be predicated on a species achieving a certain level of social and spiritual maturity, a maturity that our brandishing of nuclear weapons clearly demonstrates we lack. In this interpretation, the UFOs that disabled the missiles were acting as benevolent, if paternalistic, guardians. They were demonstrating that our self-destructive tendencies would not be permitted to escalate beyond the confines of our own planet. It was a cosmic intervention, a shot across the bow, a clear message. Your toys are too dangerous. We can take them away from you whenever we choose. This is a comforting, almost messianic view of the phenomenon. It casts the visitors as saviors, protecting us from our own worst impulses. But there is a darker, more unsettling interpretation. What if the interest in our nuclear weapons has nothing to do with our salvation? What if it is about strategic assessment? Any intelligent species considering an interaction with another, especially a species as volatile and violent as our own, would first want to understand its capabilities. What is their most powerful weapon? How does it work? How is it controlled? And most importantly, how can it be neutralized? In this light, the events at Malmstrom and other bases look less like a warning and more like a reconnaissance mission, a military probing of defenses. The object over Echo Flight was not delivering a sermon, it was gathering intelligence. It was testing its ability to disable our ultimate defense system, and it succeeded, flawlessly. This interpretation shifts the emotional tone from one of hope to one of profound dread. We are not being protected. We are being sized up. The silence from the visitors is not the silence of a wise guardian, but the silence of a predator studying its prey. The implications are chilling. It suggests we are in a strategic game we don't even know we are playing, against an opponent whose capabilities are so far beyond our own that they can treat our most secure military installations as their personal laboratory. There's a third possibility, one that is perhaps the most alien of all. What if their motives are simply beyond our comprehension? We try to understand their actions through the lens of human psychology and military doctrine, warnings, threats, strategy. This may be as foolish as an ant trying to understand the motives of a human who steps over its anthill. Their interest in our nuclear technology may be something we can't even guess at. Perhaps they are drawn to the massive energy signatures. Perhaps they are studying the effects of radioactivity. Perhaps their message is not a message at all, but merely the incidental byproduct of a process that is as alien to us as our own thoughts would be to a bacterium. The mystery of echo flight, therefore, transcends the simple question of, are we alone? It forces us to confront far more difficult questions. What is the nature of power? What is the meaning of security in a universe that may contain intelligences millions of years older and more advanced than our own? The incident at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967 is a stark and humbling reminder that our control over our world and our destiny may be a fragile illusion. The 10 red lights on Captain Keller's console were more than just a technical failure. They were a signal, a momentary glimpse into a reality far larger and more complex than we have ever allowed ourselves to imagine. The final, lingering question is perhaps the most important. The events happened. The witnesses were credible. The technology failed. Yet, the official story remains one of coincidence and malfunction. Why, after all these years, does the silence persist? Perhaps the truth is not being withheld because it would cause panic. Perhaps it is being withheld because it would cause a fundamental, irreversible shift in human consciousness, a change in our understanding of our place in the cosmos so profound that all our terrestrial squabbles, our politics, our religions, and our wars would be rendered instantly and utterly meaningless. And perhaps for the authority, that is the most terrifying possibility of all.